everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, this evening, wherever you might be joining us from. And I'll ask for all of you who are not speaking, if you can please remain on mute. That way it doesn't cause interruption to the speakers. And for those who are not speakers, if you can also be off camera, that way there's a better ability to spotlight the speakers who will be providing us with a lot of information today regarding the topic of this panel, which is titled Violence and Deterrence Policies at the Border, Who's Responsible? And so just a few housekeeping details. I mentioned the camera, I mentioned the audio being on mute, but I'd also like to know where everyone is joining us from. So if you could be so kind as listing your name and perhaps the city or town where you're joining us from in the chat, including maybe if you're a member of an organization, that would be helpful for us to know as well. And it gives us an idea of how the outreach, whether the outreach was effective or not in getting this out to friends and people interested in the topic. So it's my pleasure again to welcome all of you this afternoon and evening. The topic is centering on what I think many of us really have been seeing over the course of the number of weeks, months, some of us years, decades. The panelists today will focus on the deadly violence against migrants on the US-Mexico border and detail some of the ways and the extent to which border enforcement policies and actions continue to add to the rising number of deaths of migrants seeking asylum in our country. The speakers will also highlight the violent context that is forcing people to flee Haiti and describe the experiences of Haitian refugees, asylum seekers at the US-Mexico border. They will also provide an eyewitness account of the violence against migrants in Del Rio, Texas. And as I believe everyone probably saw the disturbing images of Border Patrol on horseback using their ropes or whatever it was to push back Haitian asylum seekers who were trying to make their way into the US. So again, addressing the role and ongoing irresponsibility or responsibility of the US government in sustaining the racist and deadly violence that shapes US policies of deterrence against asylum seekers in the 21st century. This panel continues the fact-finding project begun by a collective called Zooming on the Border, which began during the fall of 2020. So I'd like to ask Carolyn Rose Avila to share with us what that collective is, Zooming to the Border, and that way we can begin with her. Thank you, Carolyn, for starting us off with a brief description of what the collective is.
Well, thank you, Pedro, and please, the group, please chime in because I'm kind of the newest member, but have been a part of the evolution of it from afar in a way. We lived in California at the time, and Lena with Laura and others had organized to highlight what was going on the border during 2000, I believe 2019, the conversations started. And there was a plan to do a caravan, actually, a media caravan with those that were concerned to go all along the border from California through Texas. And of course, the group ended up in its planning stages, ended up facing the pandemic. And so the pandemic actually converted the group into a zooming group that is now zooming to the border. And being able to zoom to the border actually had some very positive outcomes that probably were not anticipated, that many more people could participate and could be a part of the discussions. And Zooming to the Border Collective has now gathered those that are active along the border and nonprofits and NGOs and community groups to be able to have an outlet to be able to talk about what they're seeing and experiencing to a much larger audience. And so Zooming to the Border has now become much more formalized as a group. And we continue to meet and do exactly what we're doing, having these discussions. But it's turned out to be a much more, it has outreach that much greater than it probably would have had if we would have actually traveled along the border. So any of you that have been a part of this can add to that if you would like.
You did a wonderful job.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Caroline. And I put in the chat the link to where a collection of some of these videos have been stored, which are on the Tribuno del Pueblo's page. And it includes you can see a collection of essays that were put together into a report with recommendations regarding immigration, migration issues that stress and deal with issues such as Title 42 and the impact of MPP, border wall, everything that was discussed during the initial sessions that were a part of the original Zooming to the Border workshops that were held online. So thank you again, Caroline. And I would be remiss if I didn't share a little bit about Caroline. So Caroline is trained as an anthropologist from the University of Colorado. She's an activist committed to the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Child. She has held various management positions in child protection with international nonprofits. She has been actively engaged with Haiti since 1984, having resided in the country following the 2010 earthquake, to lead child rights team and child protection uniting children separated from their families. She also worked in the Dominican Republic to advocate for Haitian families seeking the right to birth certificates for their children born there. And since 2018, she's been working with asylum seekers in Tijuana, recently active, as she mentioned, as a member of the Zooming to the Border collective. I'd also like to take this time to introduce our other speakers as well, beginning with Geraldine. Geraldine Joseph is a co-founder and executive director of Haitian Bridge Alliance, also known as the Bridge, which advocates for fair and humane immigration policies and provides migrants and immigrants with humanitarian, deportation defense, legal, social services, with a particular focus on Black migrants from the Caribbean and Africa, the Haitian community, women and girls, the LGBTQA+ individuals, survivors of torture, and deals with other human rights abuses impacting those communities. Concerning families in detention, the Bridge often plays the role of first responders and works with various organizations and partners to provide culturally informed assistance, including country conditions, translation and interpretation, communication with the families, and referrals to legal service providers. Our other speaker will also be Michelle Garcia, who's a journalist and essayist. She is currently a Soros Equality Fellow through the Open Society Foundations and the Dulby Paisano Writer in Residence. She's working on a nonfiction book about borders and their powerful influence on US identity, politics, culture, and the culture of violence. Her work has appeared in all sorts of places, including the Oxford American, Guernica, the New York Times, CNN.com, Columbia Journalism Review, The Atlantic Quartz, Inside Crime, NACLA, Salon, Al Jazeera, America, among others. And what really caught our attention was her article, Security Theater, recently published in October in The Intercept. We'll also have Eddie Canales, who will speak on his experience. He's currently the director of the South Texas Human Rights Center in Falfurrias, Texas. He attended the University of Houston, where he became involved with Mayo and La Raza Unida Party, beginning a long history of political activism and organizing. He has served in social and economic justice movements in many capacities and with several organizations. He currently chairs the National Network for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. And he's been an organizer in many states, including Colorado, New Mexico, Eastern Washington, Montana, Idaho, Texas, and Wyoming. And then, let's see, I think I covered everyone. So we'll begin then with the first question, and just as a for the speakers, I did provide times, but those times are more serve as a guide. If at any moment you want to share more than or less than the allotted time, that's great as well. So Geraldine, I'll begin with you. And again, I think I want to thank all of you for joining us today. So, returning to the question of Del Rio and the Border Patrol's disturbing response in pushing Haitian asylum seekers back to Mexico, all of us, I believe everyone here was appalled at this. But while the Biden administration officials, such as the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas and Vice President Harris stated that they were horrified by the Border Patrol's conduct. From your perspective, is this outcry simply for the benefit of public relations? Since Del Rio, what has happened to the Haitian asylum seekers? How would you situate this violence that we witness as part of a longer tradition of violence that Border Patrol engages in?
Thank you so much, Pedro. And as you mentioned, we all saw what we have been dealing with for a very long time, or should I say, the world finally had a window about the realities that Black migrants specifically have been dealing with at the US-Mexico border, and the cry that the Haitian Bridge Alliance, alongside other organizations, have been literally sounding the alarm, saying this is happening. This has been happening since 2015. And then moving into 2016, 2017, we know all the last 4 years. And unfortunately, we see the same policies such as Title 42, MPP, are continuing at the US-Mexico border. What we saw is not lost on the Haitian community. We can go back decades. We can look into the 1970s, 1980s, when asylum seekers were fleeing Haiti because of political turmoil. At the same time that Cuban asylum seekers were leaving Cuba for the same reason, political dictatorship in Cuba. And we also know very clearly that the Haitians were turned away, to the point where they were sent to Guantanamo Bay, giving us the current immigration prison system we have today. So the picture, the treatments that the world were able to finally see from under the bridge is not new to the Haitian community. And what we saw, I was there. And what I tell people as a Haitian American woman, a Black immigrant, not only a Black immigrant, but a Black immigrant descendant of enslaved people in the Americas, that was beyond appalling, because we can literally see how the system is completely rooted in anti-Black racism, the fear of Haiti itself, the fear of Haitian people, and the fear of Black bodies. And we can see from those pictures, they were chasing men carrying food. Now let that sink in. The men they were chasing were simply carrying food to pregnant women and children who were still on the US side, who were not given water or food. So they were forced to go back to Mexico to purchase food to bring to people who were under the bridge on the US side. And on the way back, they were met with extreme violence, extreme racism, extreme prejudice, and the majority of them have been erased. And I will repeat, the majority of those people have been erased. Their realities have been erased, their abuse have been erased. That's why it is outrageous for the administration yesterday, literally, to put out the memo stating that they have refused to do the investigation on what happened in Del Rio. But what we said, how can you do an investigation when you have deported 9,000 of the eyewitnesses and 9,000 of the potential victims of what happened? We cannot even believe any part of the report anyways, and who will be accountable? Because what I say is whatever happened under the bridge happened because the administration continues to permit this anti-Black racist system to flourish, giving a space for people with ill intentions, people, human traffickers in Mexico, to be able to not only thrive, but thrive on the backs of those asylum seekers. So to date, Pedro, what has happened is that close to 9,000 of the people who are in the Rio have been deported. That includes pregnant women and children and babies. Actually, yesterday we were speaking with one of those people who were deported, and the man started crying. And he said that they were handcuffed, and then their hands, and then their feet, and that was then attached to a chain on the waist. And one woman that had a baby couldn't really hold the baby on the plane. The baby fell and rolled. And the officers just stood there and watched. It wasn't until they started screaming and crying, say, please help, 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 that one of the officers came and picked up the baby and unlocked one of the woman's hand to be able to get the baby, back into the mother's arms. That is the reality of what we are dealing with. That is the treatment that people, after making that journey, to be taken into custody for 7, 8, up to 12 days without access to any hygiene, no access to even able to brush their teeth, and then be deported in a conditions like that. And I say people of Haitian descent because it's not just Haitians, people who were born in Haiti. The majority of those children were born in countries such as Brazil, Chile, or Mexico, because they have been forced to stay in Mexico for the past 5 years. Now we'll say 3 different administrations, 3 different presidents have been in the White House, starting with President Obama, Trump, and now with President Biden, continued the mistreatment of Black people, Black young men, young women, children at the US-Mexico border. Another thing I want to highlight when it comes to the Haitians specifically, it wasn't until we had Black faces in a large number at the border that we started talking about an invasion. It wasn't until the Haitians came due to misinformation that were given to them by the human traffickers and others that we ended up having this fear of Black people or Black faces at the US-Mexico border. So to answer your question, Pedro, this is not lost on us as a country. This is not lost on us as a community. This has been our experience. We understand that Black people in immigration detention are given higher number of bond. That's why we started the first Black Immigrants Bail Fund, to be able to address those issues, but at the same time pushing for change in policies, and right now asking for the Biden administration to immediately end Title 42, stop the deportation, and allow people to safely ask for asylum.
Thank you, Geraldine, for your powerful testimony, and also recognizing that you and other members of Haitian Bridge Alliance were on the ground and trying to deal with the enormous pressures and of the violence that was being perpetrated against the Haitian asylum seekers at that moment, and for sharing with us that many of them, were disappeared. In fact, as you say, the witnesses as well as the victims have been disappeared. And how can the government conduct an appropriate investigation where the OIG has declined to investigate, as you mentioned? a lot of the news coverage framed the arrival of the Haitian asylum seekers as unexpected. Michelle, what you write about in your article in The Intercept is that, in fact, the arrival of Haitians to Del Rio was anticipated, and that the government's response centered more about creating the spectacle of force and violence than responding to the humanitarian needs of migrants themselves. Can you talk about how you arrived at that conclusion based on your research and what you saw on the ground?
Sure, of course. And it's such a pleasure to be here with you all. As Pedro just mentioned, I wrote a piece that was published October 1, I believe, in The Intercept. So when I went to Del Rio months earlier, during the summer, there had been a large number of mostly Central Americans and some South Americans, like Venezuelans, who had arrived in Del Rio and who had been detained or housed or penned into the same bridge. That had also happened in the Rio Grande Valley. So further down the river along in South Texas, in McAllen, a park, people had been under a bridge, and then people had been put in a park. So in the case of Del Rio, I had been planning to go in those summer months when people were being held under the bridge. And I think it's important to kind of take a minute to stop and reflect on the fact that the holding of people in excruciating heat outdoors for days on end under a bridge, which we saw during the Trump administration, has become itself quite a spectacle, particularly in right-wing media, on Fox News. That spectacle, that human misery, is used as footage to blame the Biden administration, to attack the Biden administration. And what needs to be, I think, explored journalistically and in the public debate is the way in which it doesn't sound alarms. The notion that people, young people, babies, women, men, doesn't matter, are in the elements for days. And the question does not seem to be asked, why are they there? Why were they not processed? Why is there not infrastructure? And so when I arrive in Del Rio, I actually arrive at the time that the mayor's holding a press conference and announcing that there are no more people under the bridge. And I observed something that I thought was very telling about where this issue stands. I observed a Haitian American city council member from New York talking to a city representative in the mayor's office. And the city representative is telling the city council member who had come in from New York that the bridge has been cleared and that commercial traffic will resume on the international bridge between Ciudad Acuña and Del Rio. And the city council member is saying, what are you talking about? There were like 2,000 people there less than about 12 hours ago. Where are they? Like you're sort of celebrating that people have been cleared as if this is a solution to the problem, but we don't know where those people are. Where did you put them? The people had been under this bridge for weeks and suddenly within a couple of days, they're all gone. Where are they? And those two perspectives confronting each other with wildly different priorities gives a glimpse to a crisis of both priorities and public expectations and dialogue and perception. Let me just restate, it's a crisis of perception. What is the problem? Is the problem that people have arrived at the border? Is the problem that there are people who are under the bridge? Or is the problem the fact that the United States government, richest country, did not have the infrastructure to process people, and therefore they were under a bridge for several weeks? There's no agreement on this to a large extent. And seeing these two people have this heated discussion, and the idea that the question that what it was largely celebrated that the bridge was cleared, and we don't know where 2,000 people went to who were there like just a few hours before, is concerning. And I will tell you why it's concerning to me as a journalist, because I've reported from Mexico. I've reported from other countries where people are disappeared. Now, I'm not saying that happened here, but in countries where people are disappeared, where people are picked up off the street, our job as journalists, our job is in civil society, is to be holding accountable the government. They can literally move your body, put it somewhere, and nobody knows where that person is. Now, I said that that was not the case here. And I'll get to your question here in a second, Pedro, but I just want to I want to pick up this that I just explained did happen in Mexico. There was numerous reports, footage where in response to US pressure, immigration officials with the Guardia Nacional went doing raids, is essentially how you say it in English, where people of Haitian descent or Haitian born, mainly who had been living in South America, as was stated earlier, who were renting hotels, renting apartments, or walking on the street, were picked up and taken away. Okay, let's think, that in the drive to address the crisis, you were picking up people from hotel rooms and apartments and off the street, just picking them up. And that did bring up memories for me of the Calderon administration, where the army and so forth would pick people off the street in the name of the drug war. So I think that let's just start with what the problem, what is the problem? And that went really far in framing the question you asked me, Pedro, because you start talking to local officials. Number one, you don't even have, first, before you even talk to local officials, you could see the number of encounters that according to government statistics, increasing exponentially in the Del Rio area in the months ahead. The statistics are there. I mean, it's online. You could see this number increasing. So this is not like it went from 0 to 100 in like 30 seconds. That's not what happened. The statistics are there. That's number one. Number two, you have the mayor and the county judge telling me people had known. The video had been online of Mexican migrant officials brutalizing people of Haitian descent and Haitian-born migrants on the southern side of Mexico when they were moving. You see the brutality. There's videos online. So we have official sources, we have the videos, we have the statistics. And so where does the surprise come from? And what is the purpose? And I think this has to be really drilled into is what is the purpose and who does it benefit to characterize it as being caught off guard, a surprise, right? Because what ended up happening in this case, when I was reporting there, is that it creates a crisis climate in which, and as I said in my piece, the only viable response is a huge mobilization of military and officers and immigration officials and state troopers. There were 800 state troopers in one county. And what I raise in the piece, and to conclude here, is that without a scrutiny of how this was not addressed, and and the numbers grew to such a large number, where you had over 15,000 people, that it then creates a climate and a situation in which the only response is a heavy-handed law enforcement response. And does that then create a template to be replicated over and over again along the border?
Thank you, Michelle. I think that's such an acute question for, when we talk about the militarization of the border, militarization of border communities, a process that has been occurring for several decades, where there has been the development of policies modeled after Department of Defense, what were called operations other than war, or low intensity conflict directives that were in place in the mid-90s. And so I see the direct link and the continuation of that. And I think here the gross saturation of law enforcement, and how this has been sort of a tumbleweed that's been growing, or a snowball that's been growing, is probably a better metaphor for it. And I think, a lot of it then leads to the question of how that plays into the question of deterrence. So I'd like to turn to Eddie. In your work, Eddie, in searching for migrants crossing into the United States, facing extreme weather conditions, and that this is mirrored in other parts of the US-Mexico border. This idea of deterring migrants is not new, but gets replicated through these policies, and it's an extension of Border Patrol's strategy implemented in the mid-90s that in some ways weaponized nature, right? Because it pushed migrants into treacherous terrain, into rugged areas where many of whom had never even been to a desert before. What do you hear from families who have lost loved ones crossing into the US? And what type of support, if any, do they receive from the US or any other country in locating or identifying their loved ones?
Thank you, Pedro, for the invitation, and Laura. What I hear from families, of course, is, desperation, anguish, their disconnect, from their family members once they cross the border. It's excruciating for them in terms of, being getting into a system where one of their loved ones has disappeared. So the information is hard to come by for them, once somebody crosses the border, unless somebody had direct communications with the person, making the trek, crossing the border with coyote, with guides, all the way through. There's information. Once somebody goes lost, information is very hard to come by. After, and then, how does an investigation start for families? And let me just, paraphrase that, or agree that what still dominates and is the enforcement only approach, in terms of immigration policy. Everything that's been described as militarization, checkpoints, weaponizing the terrain, and then those efforts that Michelle described regarding, putting all the Haitians underneath the bridge. It was a military exercise. And so families, it's very, very hard to get information. And in reality, any type of denuncia or, recording of the disappearance starts with the consulates. And also with ourselves, or an NGO like the South Texas Human Rights Center, it's also incumbent on us to try to assist and hold that process and listening to the families. This is the only window that the families have, is listening, somebody that's going to explain the process, what has happened, especially on the Texas border, US-Mexico border, in terms of the disappearance or go missing, or families knowing that somebody was left behind and could be effectively has already perished. In terms of our attempts here to assist, from government, it's very minimal, in the sense that we do have a relationship with the Brooks County Sheriff's Department in Falfurrias, Texas. They, facilitate in the identification process. The recovery, it's still it's constant. This year, 111, 112 bodies have been recovered in Brooks County. So, we have a model, in the sense we're working with the Sheriff's Department, who is very limited in resources in terms of doing any more investigations of cases that we get as it pertains to Brooks County. So when we develop missing migrants program protocols a few years back in 2015, it was an attempt for Border Patrol to provide us, with information of somebody that could have been detained, and then also reacting to some rescue operation based on locations of GPS coordinates. That is not something that is happening extensively. That is the Missing Migrants program has evolved to, helping, developing a fingerprint process, technology to help identify people that have already had deportations before and are in the system. So, it's families are desperately searching. We're, constantly, take a call where their family is, that have to piece it together, even where, they've registered their case with the consulates and they get no response. The consulates is not gonna, push the government to do more searching. So it's actually more, it falls on the South Texas Human Rights Center or other NGOs to follow up, regarding trying to recover a body or trying to rescue somebody. I kind of gave the situation in terms of, this webinar, in terms of how we, and the framing of it, violence and deterrence. There's so many forms of violence, that families deal with throughout the, and one of them, of course, is the continuation of a militarized colonization along the border, in that respect. So policies are a continuation of that. So, I'll leave it at that. I have some other, forms that violence has taken place I'd like to share, and I'll share that, in another particular question. So I don't want to, seek. Let's hear from the other panelists, and we'll talk a little bit more about what the forms of violence are taking place.
Great, thank you, Eddie. Thank you for your perspective, and I think what the perspective that you offer is that this has been a pattern, a continuation of a pattern that has existed now for a long time, and I, unfortunately, a question has come up for me here, which we don't have to answer, that others have asked, whether the pushing of Title 42 and MPP and things of that nature will cause migrants to seek out other more dangerous routes in trying to cross into the US. And as you mentioned, the increased number of people that are dying in Brooks County, we also see that in Arizona and California as well. The numbers are increasing. Caroline, I'd like to turn to you. In my conversations with migrants in Tijuana, I've heard migrant mothers talk about what they call la autoseparación, or self-separation. It's almost as if, instead of the US government forcing family separation like it was being done under Trump's and Jeff Sessions' zero tolerance policy, Now that decision is forced upon families in Mexican border towns in terms of how Title 42 is applied. In your conversation with migrants, what's your sense of how Title 42 might be an extension of a deterrence strategy? And what other hardships do migrants face that could be avoided if the US government observed its international obligations to asylum?
Okay, I'm on. Thank you, Pedro. I appreciate having this opportunity and seeing familiar names and faces. You know, my experience has been some on the border, quite a bit in Haiti, and then in the Dominican Republic. I was trying to work to help mitigate child trafficking on the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic following the earthquake. And then just the horrible situation for Haitians that are found in the bateys in the Dominican Republic, and then what is happening now. And I don't know if anybody has seen some of the pictures of how the Dominicans are literally going up and down streets, border town streets with Haiti, and telling people to get out. Haitians to leave the next morning. There will be, otherwise they'll be rounded up. So the circumstances are very dire for Haitians. And I just wanted to add that because we need to keep our Haitian brothers and sisters in the forefront as the country is going through such a painful situation. First, I'll address Title 42, but in general, I'd like to just share this one piece of data that will put to rest the issue that is so prevalent in our immigration policies, and that's racism. Black asylum seekers are the ones have the lowest acceptance rate, 4.6% amongst all racial or national groups. And if you don't, we don't need to say any more than that. It's the lowest acceptance rate, 4.6%. And Title 42, actually, even though it's predicated on a public health, some obscure public health code that was to protect the country from any particular contagious diseases, it has just been one more of the tools in the toolbox to deter those that are trying to seek safety. It is what it does, Title 42. Well, first, to address the issue of women in Tijuana or anywhere that matter along the border, they know that children, unaccompanied children, can get in, and they will not be stopped by Title 42, but they will be, and they would be expelled and not their child. So it creates a kind of a catch-22 that they need to decide for the best of their children. And often they send their children and they separate themselves from their children. And that is, of course, it's totally inhumane, but the whole system's inhumane. We've got all kinds of policies. I think we all know them. Wait in Mexico policies, metering policies, Title 42, externalization, which I want to get to, externalization and chain expulsions that are being used to expel to one country, then that expels to the next country and finally back to their home country. But Title 42 allows the US to do rapid expulsions. And allows the rapid expulsions, allows anyone that gets expelled to come back. So we have a distortion in the numbers of those trying to come across the border as well, because the repeats of people coming back has gone from 7.6% prior to the pandemic to 42% now. And that means people are trying to come in because the rapid expulsions, they don't have to go through any process of even being their asylum cases being heard. They're just expelled, and that is used as the excuse. And it's usually used really based on nationality or racial group or groups that we as as the system, which is a very criminal system, is trying to keep out of our country. There is data that says that rapid expulsions due to Title 42 has led to at least 7,500 rapes, kidnappings, deaths, different types of violence since the Biden administration. And that is just since the Biden administration. So it is a very violent, the outcome of Title 42 turns out to be a very violent deterrence. But it's a part of the whole program from my point of view, because what we've done is criminalize our immigration system. And we've criminalized it and we've militarized it. The CBP is the largest in the world, the largest police force in the world. There's over 60,000 officials, authority figures in that. So I think if we look over history, we can see how the US, and it's not only the US, other countries are beginning to try to criminalize. For example, Mexico has become a real partner with the United States. We have, as some have written, Trump created his wall, but his wall was a policy wall. And he recruited Mexico to build that policy wall. And so Mexico, because they were threatened with tariffs, that they then took on a whole immigration system similar to the US and has pushed its focus down to Tapachula, which now used to be considered a humane crossing point. And it is now seen as a very militarized border. And that is a part of this bigger picture of how we're criminalizing immigration systems. Really, basically, very wealthy countries, which is externalization. If we look at the data globally, very wealthy countries are externalizing their immigration policies. They are exporting, basically they are avoiding the responsibility of the humanitarian responsibilities that we have with those seeking asylum and pushing them off into poorer countries. And we can see that all over the world that we're doing this. And so we're externalizing it and we're washing our hands of the responsibilities. The factors that I wanted to add that there's so many push factors. I think the one thing that I would really like us to get to.
Joe Biden for pulling us out. He didn't inherit a plan. He inherited, thank you, a deadline negotiated by the previous administration that he then had to enforce. If Hillary Clinton had been president, there would have been a plan.
Is somebody speaking?
Please mute.
Go ahead, Carolyn.
Okay, all right, okay. I think we need to recognize that my issue has always been we need to have a new narrative about migration. Because as we look at the numbers, and the numbers only increase, and it's for a very human reason, people are looking for safety. And as they increase, we just keep trying to harden our policies, but it's not going to go away. And I think that's where we need to figure out how do we face this and realize this is not going to go away. Caravans are humanitarian. They're very human people that are trying to find a safe territory, a safe place to be. And we might talk about, and specifically with Haitians, we may talk about people being jobless or homeless, but Haitians that have migrated to the border are now stateless. And they're no longer related to any particular country. And we have not recognized that from a humanitarian perspective. We have lost what immigration, what refugee status meant post-World War II. It no longer, we no longer address the humanitarian concerns, but we are trying to keep people out. So Title 42 is just a part of that. There's a very good fellow that I've done some reading of, some of his writing is Jeff Chris. He used to work at the UNHCR, and now he writes independently. And he talks about how we are globally externalizing the global north is externalizing its responsibilities for humanitarian assistance to those seeking shelter and seeking refuge. So Title 42, again, is just one part of the arsenal of militarizing and criminalizing refugees and asylum seekers and militarizing the borders. So that's what I would like to contribute to the discussion at this point.
Great, thank you, Carolyn. And what struck me about what you just said is this idea that the idea of externalization, and we've seen that in immigration policy proposals going back to the McCain-Kennedy proposal of the mid-2000s, where they suggested also externalizing the surveillance of international waters of the global south. And so this has been a trend also that has made its way through different proposals. But also the confusion, I think, of what you mentioned of the a sense of statelessness for Haitian asylum seekers is also represented in how the US government applies policy in a very confusing way. So if you go to the State Department's page, it has Haiti listed at a level 4 travel advisory stating, quote, "Do not travel to Haiti due to kidnapping, crime, civil unrest, and COVID-19, unquote." Yet the US keeps supporting Haitians, Geraldine, as you've pointed out, even after the Department of Homeland Security granted TPS to Haitians residing in the US without status as of May 21st of this year. What is at the root of this institutional discrepancy? And I know you've alluded to this when you spoke earlier, Geraldine. Why is it that these government agencies are in complete contradiction to each other and proposing policy that leads to this confusion? If you can say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I don't think they are really in confusion with each other. For example, for the TPS, it wasn't something that was granted voluntarily. It was a long fought battle. I mean, I don't think I could even explain to people how difficult it was to actually get that TPS for Haiti. But we're able to win that battle. But at the same time, as you mentioned, Pedro, yesterday they deported people to Haiti, but they also saying all US citizens in the country must live. And American Airlines just decreased their flights from 3 to 1 to Haiti right now, literally locking people who are in Haiti unable to leave the country. But at the same time, the United States has spent $15 million just on deportation flights to Haiti. But we must also understand the relationship, the history between Haiti and the United States. The fact that the very existence of Haiti as a country and of us as a people is unacceptable to the West, unacceptable to the United States, to France, and all the powers that are governing the world. So with that being said, from the beginning, the United States made sure that Haiti will never prosper by denying our freedom for over 60 years. And we see that the anti-Black racism is at the root of all of it, because if Black people in the United States know that they too can be free, that will be an issue for the United States. At the same time, understand that Haiti is one of the countries that has given and sacrificed the most for the United States. And the only country that actually fought for the United States, right? But yet we see as Black people, we will never be accepted. So the policies that we speak of, they are not contradicting each other. They are working in perfect harmony unless you and I fight for justice for the people who are in need of protection. And that is why, as we look into 3 different presidents, right? we see a continuation of policies such as MPP, Title 42, metering, closing the border. And I think it was Carolyn who mentioned what's happening, or it was Michelle who mentioned what was happening as far as the border itself. We see that the US policies have pushed the border all the way down to Panama, where no longer people can continue their journey once they get to certain countries. In addition to that, Black bodies in motion, whether from Haiti, LGBTQ, from Jamaica, people fleeing Cameroon, people fleeing Mauritania because of modern day slavery, we don't have a safe space anywhere throughout the journey. And in Mexico, we see the ingrained racism and push and force from the United States that makes it impossible for Black migrants from Haiti to even survive in Mexico. And now that Mexico is using Tapachula as a prison state to cage people and make sure they're unable to continue their journey. So when we look at policies, we look at the United States, we look at the powers that be, the reality is racism is at the root of every single policy, no matter who's at the White House. That is why it is imperative for us to continue to fight for justice, say no to internal violence and no to external violence, such as policies, US policies towards Haiti that make it impossible for people to stay in the country.
Thank you, Karen, for that wonderful insight. And I think what you mentioned about Tapachula is exactly how my colleagues in Chiapas have. Essentially, it's become a state, a territory that replicates itself almost like a prison. Sort of, Michelle, what you were describing earlier in terms of how this gets replicated or could possibly be replicated in other areas. So my colleagues with the Southern Border Communities Coalition were in Del Rio also in a fact-finding visit during this time when the Haitians were confined to that space, and they were both stunned and alarmed at the show of force of the different diverse law enforcement agencies that were on the ground. In fact, they couldn't get hotel rooms because police forces had booked most of them up to 45 miles outside of Del Rio. And they were stopped and questioned multiple times while in town about what they were doing. What might this foretell about the direction in which governments will use militarization to manage migration, especially with how climate change might force people to migrate in our hemisphere? And I use managed migration specifically because this is how the Biden administration has been framing, trying to distinguish the work that they do on the border and around immigration internationally versus what's been done in the past.
That was directed at me, right?
Yeah, Michelle, to you.
Okay, so I think to preface my response to that, I'd like to highlight something. I wrote a piece a couple of years ago for a new magazine called Ari, which is about foreign policy. And they wanted me to do something about the US-Mexico border. And it so happened that right before they commissioned, they solicited some proposals from me, I had gone to San Antonio, Texas to get my truck fixed. And I go to this museum where the Jenny Holzer, who's an artist, had compiled the memos and reports that had been declassified, in response to the ACLU's lawsuit, that focused on, among other things, Guantanamo Bay and the detention of people in the war on terror at Guantanamo Bay, Gitmo, right? And you read, I remember turning just randomly to one fax that had been sent to then Secretary of State Colin Powell, saying that there were children being detained and they're describing the conditions. And as I'm reading this, I'm like, these are the hieleras. These are all the descriptions sounded like what was happening on the US-Mexico border. And it sent, like, I felt this alarm, right? Like, that the similarities between Guantanamo and US immigration policy, border policy. We'll come to find out that Guantanamo as a site of detention for, as it was known, Gitmo in the War on Terror, it goes back to the detention of Haitian asylum seekers in the 1990s. And what I write then is that what was happening during the, and I was in New York at the time, working for the Washington Post, what was happening after 9/11, there, the connections, these connections between war on terror, national security, so forth, and immigration were being made by advocates and so forth. But in terms of the discussion, right, or going back to 1990s Haitians, like, and then jumping ahead to the Trump era, right? What ends up happening, I think, from my perspective as a journalist, is that these are seen as silos. They are isolated, episodic moments in time that seemingly have no connection, only because the people who are being detained are either detained for seemingly, for different reasons, right? The justification for detaining a Haitian in the 1990s is different than Guantanamo and War on Terror, which is different than the detention conditions in the Trump administration. But we're evaluating this and we're discussing it based on who's being detained and jailed, if you will, not the similarities and the sort of legacy of government policy. And I think that was very sobering to me in terms of my perspective. Are you standing inside the cell or outside the cell? Or, who's the jailer? Who's the jailed may change, but who's the jailer, right? I have a difficult, I can't predict where this is going. I can't predict anything at all. I think that's beyond the capacity, my capacity as a reporter. But I will say that it is now, there are Haitians in the shelter in Ciudad Acuña to this day. My article posted October 1, it's November 17th. They're still in a shelter, in tents, right? I mean, the sort of, I think that there is this normalizing to a certain extent. And I'm not really sure where this goes, but what it seems like what is happening is that there's a reckoning about framing these issues. So I think that that's partly answers your question. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And I think that normalization of inhumane treatment, normalization of violence, is, from my point of view, is one of the elements of the prevention through deterrence strategy that Border Patrol put in place in the mid-90s, right? It's like you normalize the presence of an agency that sees itself as a paramilitary force. So then people stop questioning that violence, and framed within the larger externalization process. I think it raises a lot of concern for a lot of people about how it's applied. And then obviously, Carolyn, with your perspective and experience and on the racism that's applied, and we haven't even talked about. I know Carolyn mentioned the rate of approval for Black migrants, but also the how expensive it is for Black migrants when they are detained in detention centers and how much it costs them to post bond, which is an enormous amount of money compared to non-Black migrants. I want to turn back to Eddie. And as you mentioned earlier, Eddie, there are a record number of migrants that are dying in Brooks County. It's clearly a humanitarian crisis, but this is worsened when you have elected officials who are exploiting the suffering, exploiting the narrative of crisis. What is the effect when someone like Texas Governor Greg Abbott continues to present this narrative that border communities are under siege, that when he uses war rhetoric and continues to mobilize the National Guard to, in his words, confront migrants? How could this contribute to an increase of migrant deaths and state violence?
Well, Pedro, that is a form of the continuation of the policy, in the Trump message, which of course is, the racist attitude, the white he projected a white supremacy vision, in terms of his political rhetoric, because he's got nothing else, in the state of Texas in terms of his ineptness and incompetency of running the state, an oil and gas state. But the xenophobia, it perpetuates xenophobia. It perpetuates, the violence that is being really spewed on the right, and I'm, the whole question of, as brought up in terms of the internalization. I mean, we're looking at the same policies of enforcement only approach, militarization only approach, incarceration, the detention centers. The only thing, the different right now is that the expulsion replace, quickly remove people, across the border, and that is certainly, creating the violence in the border region on the Mexican side. So state violence is the use of force. I mean, Pedro, we're very aware of, the shootings and by Border Patrol, and how qualified immunity was given to Border Patrol agents, by the Supreme Court in terms of using that, in terms of the killings of shooting people across the border. The checkpoints are, clearly a form of, of the militarized aspect of the Guard, and, people coming to the border is nothing new. It's been going on for the last, at least Perry did it, and Abbott continues to do it. So we're going over a decade in terms of the militarizing the border, in terms of, moving and trying to maintain that base that the right has. The separation that was mentioned by Caroline, or people splitting, their families, for that situation is, but the separation of families has been inside the big cities for the longest time. So, so it's not a new policy, and it was a more very zero tolerance policy that was reflected by the Trump administration to play up. The reduction of the humanitarian visas, the whole question of the emotional violence that people go through in terms of the loss, and the disconnect of, people that when people cross the border and there's no information at all in that respect. So in terms of us struggling as an NGO that has limited, we have some limited capacity in terms of the investigations, where people go missing, but that is certainly a form of emotional violence that people go through, and the denial of dignity and justice. So I want to also say that the violence is created, our policies creates the violence all the way throughout the journey in Mexico, as has been mentioned before. So this situation, you know, in terms of deterrence or the violence by deterrence, it continues to be implemented, but it does not stop the flow of migration at all. And it is not a deterrence, it is just a tool to, you know, it's it's a very racist tool in terms of but more so in terms of the militarized aspect of it at the border between the United States and Mexico. So including the Remain in Mexico policy and including, you know, Title 42, you know, those are issues that we continue to deal with right now. So we've had 3 administrations in a row dealing with the same, implementing the very basic same policies of deterrence and creating so much migrant deaths and unaccountability on the border.
Thank you, Eddie, for your perspective again. And I think what struck me, what you said about NGOs being, not as obviously not as well resourced to respond to the enormous amount of pressures that we see in terms of these violent policies that creates so much of a crisis for people that are on the move, that are migrating.
Yeah. I'm sorry, if I can say that, the fact that, the fact that there are people still coming to the border, and I was going to highlight the fact 1,300,000 is the numbers of that Border Patrol put out there regarding the apprehensions. And you look at what percentage, and having discussions with some Border Patrol agents or person in charge of trying to ascertain how many got away, what are the getaways, so how many people do enter the country in this context right now. So if you look at, a 20%, or, you're looking basically of that 1,300,000, you're looking at 26,000 people, migrant essential workers that made it in, and because that's the only purpose that people are migrating, is to get to a place to work, to be able to provide for families on both sides of the border, or either the receiving country that they come from, from the US, and from the sending country. So again, I just want to, make the call for pathways of regularization for people, at the border, in terms of the way that the labor is needed, and how we forge that in terms of regularizing populations, people that are coming. 26,000 is not a lot of people that made it through, in terms of, but they're undocumented, they're irregular. So that's the labor that is needed, an undocumented irregular labor, so it can be more exploited and with less and less rights.
Thanks, Eddie. And I think what you mentioned there, a little bit changing course a little bit on that topic, you mentioned the gotaways, and Border Patrol put out a video about 2 years ago that slowly made the rounds, where they were presented this gotaway, and it was essentially framing a racist approach at how Border Patrol missed someone, didn't detain them. And then in their video, they showed how that individual then stabbed someone on the street. And again, part of the propaganda machine that they use is to try to justify their budgets, right? So there's always been a contradiction between when CBP is pushing for funding, as well as with ICE, and how that works in appropriations in Congress and such. And I think, Michelle, you wanted to comment on this point as well.
I do. Thank you, Pedro, for the floor here. Two things, which is, and this also ties into your question to me a minute ago. From my perspective, and the way that the border and migration is framed, is that this is a situation in where humanity of people there's a pleading for humanity of people, right? You're pleading for them. And that is set against these questions of security or, oh, there's so many of them, so forth. And that is problematic because what I have found, and I've reported on immigration my entire career at different times in different ways, if you have to plead for people's humanity, there is something very wrong. And the second part to that is I think, and I'm working on a book about borders, as you mentioned. One of the things that I circle back to is, how do we know that the border's not there? Have we reached the point where the only way that we know that the border is doing its job is that if we see those images that you just described in that documentary, that is now synonymous with a functioning border, whatever that function is. It is the people on horseback. It is the helicopters. It is the Broncos. And if that is the only way in which you can, or not you, but one, that is the paradigm through which we know that the border is doing its job, then that's an inherently very targeted and limiting perception and understanding of what the border is. And I'll just close by saying, when I try to describe this concept of like the border functioning, right, or what would have happened in Del Rio, think about those images that we see in Tijuana of all those cars in lines, right, trying to get over the bridge. And what we see and why they show it is so that we can see the cars, right? So many people going to work, going shopping, going to school, whatever. But what we also see in those images is the border functioning, right? Facilitating the crossing. And I tell this to people, I'm like, the border is a bridge. Ask anybody who's actually here. And to them, it's a bridge. And so I think that these larger global paradigm issues are critical in terms of understanding what's happening now and why this country seems to go in circles and circles and circles, intensifying its law enforcement posture, or as we saw in Del Rio, a kind of, not kind of, but a spectacle of violence.
Thank you, Michelle. That's such a fascinating point to me, because what I've been calling out here, my experience in the San Isidro Tijuana border has been how Customs and Border Protection oftentimes will use collective punishment in order to frame a narrative, which is an anti-migrant narrative, and justify then the violence that they use and the violence in policy by convincing those who are troubled when they're crossing the border, because they have to close the border and do their exercises. And this is, from my perspective, a form of collective punishment that influences thought, influences narrative, shapes narrative, which is then again the justifying of their violence. And turning now to you, Carolyn, having worked with NGOs and having lived and worked in Haiti and in the Dominican Republic, as you mentioned, where does agency lie for migrants themselves? What space is there for them to show up and demand that their dignity be respected?
Okay, thank you. Pedro, before I really jump into that, because we haven't addressed either, which I think is somewhat related to what I'm going to say, but is the advocacy side of the equation in terms of US foreign policy over the years and how those policies have created push factors for people to be migrating. And people have very short-term memories, and they don't oftentimes understand US foreign policy and don't think about it. So Haiti is a wonderful petri dish to look at US foreign policy and how it has created such a set of circumstances for people to be fleeing. People know about the eradication of pigs, US foreign policy, the eradication of importation of rice. All of that is a US foreign policy. Environmental degradation, all of that has been, you can trace it back to US foreign policy issues that have created all of these push factors. Sustainable agriculture has been wiped out because of climate change. So it's almost as if we're washing our hands of a set of responsibilities or outcomes of our policies that we don't want to face. So we as nonprofits and organizations really have to keep that front and center in the discussions about immigration from my point of view. So going specifically about those that are totally vulnerable to this immigration system, the system relies on vulnerability. It relies on powerlessness. And I think that we, through nonprofits and migrants themselves, really there's a real opportunity to organize. There's so many nonprofits, and only within coalitions can we really make a difference rather than trying to be out there on our own. We can't be working on our own. We can't only be focused on services, but looking at how people become more empowered and those that are a part of the system, how they can learn to stand up for themselves. And I will speak I always speak often about a group I've worked with when I was in Tijuana, Al Otro Lado. And what I really respected about the work they did is that they worked with those that were looking for legal help with their asylum claims, is that they provided education on their rights. They provided education on the immigration system and how to approach it and what is the language. I mean, people are coming without any understanding of this entire apparatus that they're going to come face and hit head on. They are the most vulnerable in that sense. They have the least knowledge, and that is what the system thrives on. So I really believe that any effort that helps people understand what they're up against and what they're dealing with and how to speak back to the system is only going to contribute to the capacity of migrants themselves to have the agency to make a difference. And for those of us that are in touch with and working with can brings about some change. And I think Gerlin mentioned how hard it was to get TPS. That is one example. That was a coalition of efforts by a number of Haitians and Haitian organizations that put pressure on the Biden administration to be granted TPS. That's the only way we're going to make any difference. And that is one of the ways that we need to feel how we can mobilize. And I think the immigration issue can fall off the screen very easily for those that are not living close to the border, that don't have anything really, that are directly impacted by it with the news. They're not in Houston, they're sitting up here in Georgia, for example. But I think I look at an organization that my husband Leno Rose Avila worked with for many years and was on the board, is Amnesty International. Amnesty International, I don't know if we realize how groundbreaking their approach was to give voice to the voiceless. They gave voice to those that were being imprisoned or tortured because of their political beliefs. And many of these countries, these states thought these people would disappear because nobody knew them really. They would just disappear. But Amnesty gave them a voice. Amnesty, how many phone calls I made to different prison systems in Chile or Ecuador or somewhere around the world, giving profile to what they were doing. And so it's kind of like we have a role to play, that we really need to keep this issue on the table, front and center, and appeal to people's better conscience about others, that we are all a part of the same planet. And one of these days, many of us that are in this cocoon will be in a situation. There will come a day that we are faced with migration. We are faced, and that we got to realize that we have a shared humanity. And we can do that because we need to take advantage of us having that capacity to do that, as well as empowering those that we're working with. Because every person has an ability to stand up to what is not right, and to be able to articulate that, even though it's difficult. But we can do that, and we have to do it in coalition.
Thank you, Carolyn, for really centering us with your thoughts. And I do want to apologize that we've run out of time. We don't have time for Q&A. And I'd like to, but I think there was a lot covered. We used our time well, and I really would like to express my appreciation to all our panelists, to Carolyn, Eddie, Carolyn, Michelle, for your insight, for your commitment to the profession that you're involved in, for really, as we say in the Zooming to the Border Collective, shining a light on the circumstances that are front and center in border communities, but also in the immigration issues overall, and how those are really pressing on us to stand up, as Carolyn was saying, and to do something about it. And so thank you again for joining us. I think at this point we'll go ahead and close off. And I've placed in the chat some of the links to where you might find our speakers and what they've written about in the past. Laura, I'm not sure if you have something that you want to close off with as representing the Zooming to the Border Collective.
Yes, there was a question on the chat and what was next. And we are planning 2 more panels for next year, starting in January. We're gonna look into the climate change and linked with migration, and also Central America, the different countries, and why are they coming and so forth. So we'll keep you posted, and thank you on behalf of our group. Zooming to the border. Okay.